I want to thank Chuck and Marion for inviting me back. It's been a couple years I've presented before, but I've known them for many years. Appreciate their friendship and their prayers, and I'll be touching on that a little bit later. My background, I'm just here as a private citizen today, but my professional background is as a supervisory special agent with a major federal law enforcement agency in which I teach tactics and firearms, active shooter defense for the facility, both for the agents and for the civilians. And then we also have a very robust tactical medic program, which is becoming more and more common with law enforcement agencies. Because as we'll see, civilian EMS won't go in until the scene is clear. If it's still warm, if the whole facility has not been cleared, they're not coming in. And so, as was mentioned earlier today, you all are the first responders. There's no such thing as the golden hour. You've probably heard that before. That's a marketing myth. It's not true. Those that suffer trauma, they need to get to the trauma surgeon within 30 minutes in general to be survivable. But it's the first 10 minutes that are actually golden, and that falls down upon you. The first person at the point of care, the injury, that puts hands on, you have the ability to save those lives in the first 10 minutes. We're going to be talking more about that as well. So I just mentioned that to show you that all of my professional background informs everything that I'm going to talk about today. Everything that you're going to see, it's not my opinion. It comes from scholarly research and journals and studies, and it's referenced, and I can send you business cards and give you my personal email later, and if you want more sources, I can send those to you. We can talk about it. I'll be here afterwards. The couple areas where it is my opinion, I will tell you. It's what I think is best practices, and my name will be at the bottom of the slide. So it's not my opinion, it's referenced from others. I'd say that I think we can all agree that a lot in the world feels out of control right now, does it not? In so many different ways. It's very disorienting, and in many ways it feels like it's not the America that we grew up in. And as Christians, we're particularly under attack. And I think much of it is spiritual, and then it manifests itself in the physical. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing, all the way down to you all being targeted as potentially violent extremists, which is nonsense. But it's very disorienting to us as Christians, even though we know it's not true. Our churches are under attack simply for staying open. I remember seeing videos of parishioners singing hymns outside, and they were arrested because they weren't wearing masks. This is not the America that we know. Churches are under attack for taking a pro-life stand. Well, that's our scriptural mandate. It's not our opinion, it's God's. And other areas of Scripture where we teach the whole teaching of Scripture, we're under attack for that too, and I think that's going to continue to get worse. So it increases your church's footprint as being potential, very realistic targets of attack for many different reasons. Our freedoms are under attack. Simply being able to refuse to take an experimental vaccine or lose your job. Our physical safety is under attack. If you travel to many of the big cities right now, you know that the violence is out of control at a lot of these places. So all that being said, a lot of what we're going to talk about today deals with that. And so many of us throughout the country, anxiety is at all-time highs, rates of depression, mental illness, and we're going to touch on that. Not only for you taking care of yourselves, but for others in your family and for your parishioners. For many people, we're simply at the physiological limit of the amount of stress that we can handle. Some of you out here have potentially lost jobs or lost income because of these lockdowns. Maybe you've lost loved ones. All that accumulates, and it builds, it's called allostatic load. It builds that pressure on your nervous system. And that nervous system requires recovery in order for you all to do your jobs. You're all here because you function in a safety or a policy role, most likely. How can you protect your churches if you're already at your limit? You can't take any more stress. And it's insidious. You may feel like you're okay, but if you haven't allowed your nervous system time to recover and widen that window that we're going to talk about, I'm going to give you very specific techniques that work to do that. If you're not doing that, you may be at your limit and not really even realize it. And on that day when violence of any form comes to your church and you're charged to protect your parishioners, you may not be able to function effectively because you're already at that limit. Or it may have significant psychological effects on you, both in the moment and for years afterwards. All of this accumulates and it continues to build. So, having said that, what we're going to talk about, what my intent to give to you is to show you some of the important things to counter this. One of the most important of which is the idea, the concept of taking control and moving, and how those two concepts often lead to life in life-threatening events, and also how just the simple idea of taking control is something that you can do in certain ways no matter what the circumstances are. Even if you can't control everything, there are a few things that you can control every single time. So we're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about barriers to control, perceptual distortions, things that you need to understand. It's very important to discuss mechanism when we're talking about these types of things, this role, this duty that you volunteer to fulfill. There's perceptual distortions and barriers that you will experience if you've never experienced life-threatening events before. And even if you have, they're all different, and you're likely to experience these again, so we're going to look at some of that. And we're also going to look at anxiety and depression rates as it affects mental health, because that's affecting our churches too, and that's kind of one of the root issues. And I can tell you also that we're going to talk about some resilience factors that are informed by science and interviews. And actually the clock hasn't started yet, the countdown clock. I'm looking at my watch though. It's just flashing at 1. These resilient factors I'm going to share with you come from the latest research, from interviews with people that have survived some of the most horrific traumas, prisoners of war, people that have suffered from domestic abuse, rape, violence, and also from special forces instructors. But I can also share with you from my personal experience. I'm in the middle of catastrophic shock trauma. I'm enduring through it. And I can tell you from personal experience, these things I'm going to talk about, I've taught it for many years, but they work. I can tell you from personal experience. The only reason I'm able to stand here in front of you today is through the power of Jesus Christ. That is it. Otherwise, I would not be able to continue to function or stand. And through trauma and grief, you find that your relationship with Him becomes ever more dear. I've never felt like I was closer, He was closer by my side than when He has to carry you through. So all these things, I say that just to share with you that these things are real and they work. Taking control was what saved Captain Chris Strickland on this day. I don't know if you've ever seen this photo before. He was a Thunderbird pilot. If you've ever seen the Thunderbirds, all the maneuvers are performed very low to the ground. So for the audience, well, he started a maneuver that he had done many, many times before, but he started at too low of an altitude. And so only 0.8 of a second before impact at 140 feet, he did those two things. He took control and he moved. And that's what saved his life. And what happened was an autopilot program was played. And it wasn't an autopilot program that was in his jet, it was an autopilot program in his brain. And that comes through training and experience. Now we're here, the genesis of these types of conferences is the active shooter phenomenon. But when we talk about that, we really need to also look at the root causes. And what we're really looking at is violence, because it's not just active shooters, it's violence that can be perpetrated in many different ways, and mental health, which is the root cause. And all the case studies I've looked at, there are significant mental health issues and a lot of red flags that were missed or ignored or went untreated. And those are the types of things we really have to look for. University of California says the level of those in the US that are suffering from stress right now is daunting. This was even before COVID. 70% of teens were saying that depression and anxiety were very problematic amongst their peers. Before the pandemic and before the lockdowns, college crisis centers were already spiking with cases. So it's just continued to get worse. During a pandemic, 40% were reporting symptoms of anxiety or depression. That's up from only 1 in 10 just a couple years before. Prior to lockdowns and the pandemic, George Bondano of Columbia University found that about 2/3 of the general public will follow a resilient trajectory. About a quarter will suffer some form of temporary psychopathology, and 10% will suffer long-lasting distress. But They don't know if those numbers are going to hold, because one of the things that triggers anxiety and depression is social isolation. So we have no idea. In fact, at the very start of the pandemic, experts were already warning of a tsunami in mental health illness that was coming. I know this is small to read, but it was important to include this chart. CDC data shows that by age, 18 to 29 years old, just 2 months ago in June, 50% had symptoms of anxiety and clinical depression. 50%, this is an emergency. And when I saw this was a couple years ago, this blew my mind. This is an emergency. This wasn't just 18 to 24-year-olds that felt depressed during this 30-day period. These, full 1/4 of the population of that age group actually considered taking their own lives. This is an emergency, and that's why it's so important for churches. It's an area that's underserved by churches. We try to feed the poor and take care of people, but one of the most, in my opinion, critical areas that we need to be focusing on, if you have any role in policy, is helping those with mental health issues. It's crucial, because when that breaks, that could also be, that's a liability for your church. That could be a violent attack upon your church. We want to try to treat those people as Christians as early as possible, early intervention. This area is underserved, I think. Christians suffer from depression too. The brain gets sick like any other organ. Disease can target any one of us. And that's why it's very important that we're aware of this. The loss of a loved one and the stress that results from a suicide, the American Psychiatric Association ranks this as catastrophic, equivalent to a concentration camp experience. And depression rates, we know they've tripled when the pandemic first hit, and they're continuing to grow. Pre-pandemic, it was 8.5%, which is still pretty high, but you look at 2020, almost 28%, and now 2022, they're continuing to rise. 1/3 of all adults are experiencing symptoms of clinical depression. It's higher in children, and it's higher in the female population. We're suffering anxiety from so many different things. The ongoing threat of terrorism. Just in the news, just recently, we saw that there's Iranian threats against high-level U.S. officials. A popular writer was just attacked yesterday, I believe. So this is a very real threat, and we think about these things. So many of our young men and women have come back from the battlefield after years of combat experience, missing arms and legs, suffering from severe PTSD now. Think of this every time we go into a crowd, like the Boston Marathon bombing. Every time I go into a crowd, I think about this. This triggers low-level stress and anxiety if we're not allowing our nervous system to recover. Active shooter attacks, like the one at Mandalay Bay, this was probably the worst one for law enforcement to have to deal with. It's the worst-case scenario. You have a city that has already a lot of lights and fireworks and loud music and mirrors, and now you have an elevated shooter shooting down on a crowd of people. When you look at so many of those videos, what I'm astounded by is survivors in the middle of it, still under attack, taking the time when they're still on the X, not behind cover, not moving to evacuate, taking the time to actually record themselves on social media. You see that over and over and over again. It is crazy. These three were doing exactly the right thing. They were moving and they were getting off the X. This is the one that really hit home with me, because my younger son was this age when this attack occurred. I don't remember Columbine because I was deployed overseas at the time, and I wasn't a parent. And as you know, if you're a parent, everything changes. Your perspective changes. And when you have kids, especially this age, I remember this one like it was yesterday. It hits not just Connecticut, but it hits the entire country because of cable news. And especially when the victims are little ones, that makes it even worse. And I tell first responders too, they have to be aware of this. The public expects them to be the ones to handle all this, but it's very different seeing it on the news than from being the one that's actually going in and seeing some of these things firsthand. A majority of U.S. teens still fear that a shooting attack in their school is likely, and this covers all different age groups. Children are suffering stress and anxiety over ecology. In Great Britain, they did a study. They found more and more children are having nightmares based on fears that the planet is going to end within a decade. And one of the key indicators, there's a lot of new emerging research that's showing rates of anxiety and depression is directly tied to the amount of time spent on social media, especially in U.S. adolescent females. Less time with the phones is required. And for those of us in this room, The rest of your life, when you see a photo like this, there's going to be a slight triggering of your stress arousal, of your stress system, and it's going to be even worse if you've lost income or if you've lost loved ones to this, or you've had to telework, long periods of time of social isolation. Every time you see a picture of somebody with a mask, it's going to subconsciously bring that back, that feeling of uneasiness. And it's even worse on our children. They're already a year and a half behind, not like we were already doing stellar on our international scores and rankings. Now they're even further behind, and so many now, they're having trouble reading and speaking because they weren't able to watch their teachers' mouths. And I told our school headmaster at the very start of this, I was much more worried about the mental health aspects of isolating our children than I was about a virus, especially one that was not shown to have children be at the highest risk factors. Inflation, that's hitting all of us, and gas, and then images of war too. So there's so much. Now we're even seeing that for the first time, over 100,000 overdose deaths, particularly due to fentanyl. Just until recently, nobody even heard of fentanyl outside of the hospital setting, where it was used as a powerful analgesic. Now it's coming in, and DEA has started a campaign now, One Pill Can Kill, because these illicit fentanyl pills that are coming in, 40% have a lethal dose of fentanyl in it. So you're literally flipping the coin. These are children that are taking these, 50% chance almost that they're not going to survive to the next morning. So why are some of us impacted in certain ways? Why do some people get more stressed out and others are able to handle it a little bit different? Well, it's because we're all different, and how we react to these events is different based on our training and our life experience. And it's not just the events alone, but it's your perception of those events that actually triggers your response to it. Has anybody heard of Viktor Frankl? If you haven't heard of him, I highly recommend his books. Man's Search for Meaning is the most important one, but also Say Yes to Life. Viktor Frankl was a Holocaust survivor. And if you think about probably the worst trauma anybody could experience, I think prisoner of war for multiple years, or concentration camps, a Holocaust survivor. He found that and he was a psychiatrist before he was placed in a concentration, and he lost everything. He lost his home, he lost his job, he lost his belongings, he lost his wife in the concentration camps, and he almost lost his own life. But his conclusion going through all of that was there's one thing that can never be taken away from you. There's one thing that you can always take control over. And that your one freedom that you never lose is your ability to choose your attitude in any given set of circumstances. Your thoughts, that's the one thing in your attitude that you can control no matter what the world is throwing at you. When the world feels like it's totally out of control, it's how you choose to respond. And as Christians, we've got the ultimate playbook. That's when we need to lean more on God. We know that even when the world feels like it's, and so many things are so wrong, there's so much lawlessness and usurping of our freedoms, we know who wins in the end, right? And so we need to always cling to that. That is a powerful protector against our own anxiety. As you see, when that event, these things that are stressing us out that we see on the news every single day, when that comes in and it crashes through our serene little pond, often the only area that we have control over is that epicenter, our thoughts and then our behaviors as a result of those thoughts. You can't even control sometimes how, within your own home, how different individuals are going to view different things. We're more divided in a lot of ways than probably ever before. And if you look at your workplace and then society as a whole, there's lots of division. The only thing that you can truly control is your own thoughts and your behaviors in relation to those. It's important to talk about mechanism. I mentioned that at the beginning because we need to understand how the brain operates. To be forewarned is to be forearmed. It's very important, so you won't be surprised at when you are suffering from a severe stress response, especially in the worst case of a life-threatening event. There's things you need to understand that are going on. You're going to be profoundly altered state in every possible way. One of the authors I recommend is Dr. John Leach. He wrote a seminal book on survival psychology. He does a lot of work with British Special Forces and also with the U.S. Air Force combat survival. He's studied this for years, and he found similar patterns of human behavior across a lot of different types of disasters, from fires to volcanoes to shipwrecks. And I've added in, I see the same thing in active shooter attacks. But he was actually present at this one, and that's something very rare, to actually witness firsthand the types of things that you study. King's Cross was a British subway system, London Underground, And what happened was a lit match fell down between the escalators and it caught grease and debris on fire, and a lot of people died. And what Dr. Leach witnessed was the most common physiological response amongst the general population in any type of disaster, and that is an unwillingness to accept the new reality that you're actually experiencing. He saw people continue to go down the escalators towards, when smoke was coming up, people were continuing to go down. He heard people asking if this means their train is going to be delayed. He saw employees of the London Underground system frozen with tears just streaming down their face, not employing fire extinguishers. So he saw all these different things, which are the same types of things that he studied. And what he was witnessing was all these individuals were suffering from acute stress response, and their body was going into the fight or flight mode. It's almost become cliche. We've all heard of that. It's an automatic physiological response, and what's happening there is your body is automatically being prepared for action. There's a cascade of neurochemicals that are released throughout the body and throughout the bloodstream to do different functions. Some of them increase your respiratory rate, so you can bring in a lot more oxygen. And that oxygen goes to a heart that is beating much faster to get more oxygen to the areas where you need it, to the brain and to major muscle groups. Cortisol is released for extra energy, and certain other systems are kind of shut down. Now, this is the immediate response, but it's the immediate internal bodily response. The immediate external response is often that of freezing. And in fact, a lot of experts are now terming it fight, flight, or freeze response, because this is actually the most common. And this is what Dr. Leach had discovered years ago from looking at all these different types of disasters. He would see that, and he coined the term statue syndrome for it, because in all these different disasters, he would see people frozen like the terracotta warriors. And if you watch a lot of the videos that come out from some of these different incidents that make the news, you will see exactly that. You will see individuals frozen. I saw that. You look at Boston Marathon bombing videos, the Mandalay Bay, the shooting that occurred in the Fort Lauderdale airport. You see it over and over and over again. It's a natural human response. And that is because of how our brains are wired. And our brains, we move and coordinate actions through chemical and electrical means. So there's an electrical signal that goes down through your neurons. In the synapses space between the neurons, neurotransmitters are released. They're taken up on the next neuron, and it becomes an electrical signal again. Well, that anytime we're learning something new or we're engaging in some sort of activity that we have to learn something new, it's not rote, we're not comfortable with it, something new, there is a release of greater amounts of dopamine and norepinephrine in the brain. Norepinephrine is the same thing as adrenaline, it's just called differently when it's in the brain. A slight amount increases your ability to perform, but under extreme stress, massive amounts are released into the brain. And what happens is, on the receiving neuron, there's a channel that opens up and the signal is lost. It's like a tunnel that veers the signal off track. A train that now is not getting the next neuron, it is going off the other direction. And the end result of that is cognitive overload, cognitive breakdown, and freezing. Now in the animal world, sometimes that may lead to life, because it's motion that attracts the predators, but in your all's world, when you're dealing with a human predator, freezing leads to death often leads to fatalities. And that's why moving is so important. Moving often leads to survival. Training to move, that's the first thing that we should be doing. There were other cases that Dr. Leach documented where he saw the exact same thing. This was an aircraft fire in Manchester, UK, but this fire didn't occur in the air where you'd expect people to possibly die. This fire occurred on the ground, on the tarmac, where you'd expect everybody to get out and everybody to live. However, those that did escape, and the British official reports after questioned, why didn't more people survive this? They all should have been able to get out. And witnesses that did survive said they reported seeing people remaining in their seats with their seatbelt fastened, clutching the rails until their bodies were engulfed with flames. That's statue syndrome. The channel opened up and the signals were lost. Same thing with this ship, the Estonia, which sank off the coast of Finland in the mid-90s. Once again, there was plenty of lifeboats. People should have been able to get off. But witnesses that survived said they reported seeing people on the stairwells clutching the handrails, unwilling and unable to move. That's statue syndrome. Dr. Leach wanted to try to put a number on this. How many people will actually function appropriately in an emergency? He estimates that as only 10%. 1 in 10 of the general population, probably due to training and life experience. So how many are going to be cognitively impaired, have severe difficulty thinking and reasoning? Another 75% of the population. And then there are going to be some that hit the opposite end of the spectrum, uncontrollable sobbing, screaming, fighting with the rescuers. That's another common thing because of the state of stress arousal that they're in. That's another 15% of the population. Now, it's probably in that 10%, I think most of the people that have training and life experience, maybe combat veterans, police officers that have exposure to violence that are in maybe some of our bigger cities, that sort of thing, they've seen it before, so their brain recognizes it for something. Others, they've never seen it before, that's when that freezing occurs. It's important to also talk about range proficiency, because we often think that, well, this is what determines our ability to survive a life-threatening event. Many years ago, New York City Police Department and LA Metro did some studies. They wanted to see if they could correlate how well officers shot on the range with how many hits they had on target in actual gun combat, and they found no correlation. In fact, in New York City, they said that, because it's so different, shooting paper in a controlled, calm environment out on the range, having good accuracy and weapons handling and knowing how to safely handle your weapon, that's a must. You have to do that. But we can't get lulled into a sense of complacency thinking that that's enough, because it's not. It's very, very different doing that versus being able to survive actual combat when your life is at risk. In fact, New York City police, they said that, because they used to have on their qualifications on the range, a 50-yard qual for a certain number of rounds. Ours did too. It was, for the first 5 rounds, was at 50 yards. And New York City said that it had been said if an officer, and the reason they did it, they said, well, if you can hit a target at 50 feet, or 50 yards, certainly you can hit that same target at 3 feet. But they said the evidence does not bear that out. There were misses at 3 feet. So they said they need to change their standard course of fire to make it match up more with what actual combat looks like, and we've done the same. There's a lot of barriers, perceptual distortions you can expect. This is one of the most common ones. You've probably heard this before. People that have been held up by gunpoint, they may say, I can't tell you what the bad guy looked like, but I can tell you exactly what the gun looked like. And this is because of how the stress response works. When we're under acute stress, there's a narrowing of the visual field. You get intense tunnel vision, and it focuses in on a single point, and everything else in the background becomes blurry. This is actual police interview data from police that had been through gunfights in Deadly Force Encounters book. Vast majority experience auditory exclusion. I've experienced this myself before, where officers will report in the middle of a gunfight they thought their weapon was malfunctioning because they didn't hear it going off. The brain, it's amazing, the gun is right there, but the brain was blocking the sounds. This is a very, very common one. Tunnel vision is also very common. Automatic pilot, that's why your training is so important, because whatever you train to do is what you're going to do in a life-threatening event when you have that extreme stress. You may not even remember what you did, or you may think you did things you didn't, or vice versa, and it's that training that is so crucial. That is why we do fire drills, because not just to check the box, but because in an actual fire, people tend to forget where the fire exit is. They even forget their own name. But it's that automatic training that cycles in and causes them to actually automatically go that path to get themselves out. I've seen one of the moms whose son survived Sandy Hook. She's actually sat in on my training. I see her when I do the alert conference presentations each year. And I've talked to her in depth, and that's how her son survived. They basically, when the shooter stopped to reload, he moved, he was frozen, he moved, and others followed him. And they went out and they followed a long track around the school. They followed the sidewalk around when it would have been a lot faster just to cut straight through the parking lot. And she asked them, why didn't you run straight through? Because they went around to a house, or they were on a corner, and a school bus driver noticed these kids were out and found out what was going on. So she took them to a little yellow house that was right around the corner to wait out the day. But when asked, well, why didn't you just make a beeline? He said, well, that's what we did during the fire drill. So it was that automaticity that was kicking in. They were following that exact same path. Even though it was longer, that's what they did, and that's what kicked in. Visual clarity often heightens. Time will often slow because the dopamine in your brain acts as a natural metronome. So when you're flooded with that dopamine, like we talked about, what it does is it speeds up that metronome. And it's the equivalent of a fast motion or slow motion camera in which you have many, many more frames per second. And what it has is this distorting effect to time. In fact, there's officers that reported One talked about, in the middle of the gunfight, he saw these brass, or these brown balloons floating in front of his field of view, and he read on the bottom of one of these balloons the word federal. What he was seeing was his own expended shell casings flying in front of his face while he was engaged with an enemy, and his eyes were able to read the writing on the bottom. There's some of the amazing perceptual distortions that are experienced. Memory loss is very common, disassociation, an unwillingness of the brain to admit that it's in this life-threatening event, wanting to think of normal things. Dissociation is also one of the key indicators of the development of PTSD later on, because there's an unwillingness to accept reality as to what it is, and that leads to, if not treated, can lead to PTSD. There's intrusive thoughts, memory is distorted, sometimes sounds are intensified, rarely time speeds up, but occasionally it does. And then temporary paralysis. This is statue syndrome. And I would tell you, I believe that it's much higher than this, because there's no shame in officers admitting that they had auditory exclusion. There's nothing wrong with that, or tunnel vision. But how many officers who are charged to protect people would admit to being frozen in the face of a gunfight? Very few would admit that, even to themselves. So I think that this number is actually much higher. Interestingly, there's also reports of loss of ability to see in color. And I think this may also be one of the reasons why the exit signs in here are red, but often you'll see them changing over to green. And we're going to talk about that a little bit too. So how do we overcome some of these barriers? Stress inoculation training is one of the key elements to that. It's changed the way we survive and win gunfights using simulated munitions, force-on-force training. We use, if you've never heard of it before, you can think of it as like an advanced form of paintball, but what we use are these simulated munitions that are non-lethal projectiles, but they leave welts. And that is crucial, because typically in training, you only get shot when you've made a mistake. And I can tell you, and that's when you want to make the mistakes in training. And I can tell you, every time that I had been shot, it's very painful, but I remember them vividly. And then when I was out on the street before I came to Texas, I was up in New Jersey division, and a lot of our work took place in New York City and northern New Jersey. And every single time before we would raid a house or do some sort of enforcement operation, I would think about these times when I was shot, and I never made those mistakes on the street. And that's the whole point of that. But those welts are what lead to the creation of what neuroscientists call emotional bookmarks. Basically, what's happening is when you go through a scenario, your brain is creating a bookmark deep in your memory system, in your limbic system. And so when you're in a real encounter, a real life-threatening event, or any type of stressful event, your brain will rapidly flip to that page that most closely resembles the trauma that you had seen before in training. And it all does it automatically. And that's because of how the brain is designed. Daniel Kahneman, in Thinking Fast and Slow, another book I recommend to you, he describes it as System 1 and System 2. Dr. Elizabeth Stanley, in Widen the Window, who I'm going to reference a lot, she calls it your thinking brain and your survival brain. System 2 is your thinking brain. That's your prefrontal cortex. System 1 is your survival brain. That's your amygdala, your fear center, your automatic processing. System 1, your survival brain, that's your emergency alert system. It's automatic, it's bottom up. It consists of your limbic system, your amygdala, your brainstem, where automatic motor functions occur. And emotions are there too, but very important to keep in mind for some of the things we're going to talk about, it's nonverbal. It can't communicate verbally with your prefrontal cortex. It's just that emergency button that's looking to be pushed in order to survive whatever type of trauma you find yourself in. It does this through the initiation of what are called primary emotions. Now these aren't, to neuroscientists, they're not feelings. These types of emotions are internal. They're automatic physiological responses. They're unconscious. Your brain is constantly scanning. Your brain is a prediction machine. Throughout the day, you're unconsciously scanning, and it's many different things. It's not just threats. You're consciously trying to make predictions about all sorts of things that are going to affect you throughout your day and throughout your life. It's continuous threat processing. It's important because the survival brain uses this to scan for threats. There's another good book I recommend to you. It's called The Gift of Fear by Gavin de Becker. And the fear, if you've never read it, I highly recommend it. I recommend it to all the teachers that I talk to, particularly women, because what he does is he does executive protection and he has a matrix to see if they have death threats against them, how likely is it that it's a real threat, or is it less of a threat? And he does it for celebrities, politicians, that sort of thing. But he interviews in the book a lot of women that have been the subject of attacks. And a lot of them say, I never could have seen it coming. And then as they continue with the interview and they start backing up from the attack backwards, they start realizing, oh, there was this, but I ignored it. Or there was this, and I rationalized it. Or I didn't want to appear rude, and so I didn't want to tell this person that I didn't need their help bringing my groceries into my apartment. These types of things. And so the whole gist of the book is to trust your intuition. That is your survival brain, because your survival, and that goes out to you all too, trust your intuition. Your survival brain can see things that your eyes have not, and that you have not consciously picked up on in your thinking brain. And then sometimes those primary emotions are not what lead to survival. For that, we rely on secondary emotions. That's where training comes in. Because a primary emotion to a life threat, a gunfire, is not to run towards it, it's to run this way. And that's why training is so important, because we have to replace those bookmarks, those primary emotional bookmarks, with secondary emotional bookmarks that are going to replace those. They're going to overwrite, think of like a computer program. Those will overwrite it, and so that in the actual event, you're going to follow those secondary emotions and not the primary ones. There's some cases of scuba divers that I read about who had died, they had drowned, but they still had air in their tanks. And they suspect it's because for some people, the urge, they panicked, and the urge to, when you're panicking, to not have something in your mouth was so overwhelming that they pulled the regulator out of their mouth and drowned. That's a primary emotion. That's a good example of a primary emotion that leads to death and needs to be overwritten with the secondary emotion of the proper training and experience before you actually do dive in the water. Because that survival brain is going to act on autopilot. And what the survival brain does, it hijacks the brain. It locks the cockpit door, and then there's nobody in the seat. And so what's going to matter is that autopilot program that's playing to run, because that is what is going to lead to survival. The thinking brain is system 2. It's top down. That's your prefrontal cortex. That's where your cognitive thought occurs, your judgment. And it's not really fully developed until about age 25. And so that's why if you have teenagers at home, you often ask them, what were you thinking? Well, the truth is they weren't thinking, because they're not fully equipped to really think yet. They don't have that judgment. They weren't thinking, they were just feeling, because that survival brain is ready to go at a very, very young age. But it's that system 2, that thinking brain, that's where we develop all of our solutions, the types of problems that we're talking about here, the complex ones. Lawrence Gonzalez in Deep Survival, another great resource I recommend to you, he likens it to a jockey and a racehorse. That jockey is the thinking brain. He is the one that has years of training, and he's going to impart it into the survival brain. That racehorse is incredibly powerful, but without the proper training, without that training ahead of time, he can either win the race or he can explode in the gate. It all depends on whether that information was able to be transferred from that thinking brain ahead of time into the survival brain to be played later. And when we do that, our thinking brain and our survival brain are acting as allies. And that is crucial, because that's not always the case, and we're going to talk about why. You've probably seen this before. This is the stress and performance curve. It's actually the Yerkes-Dodson curve. It can be applied to a lot of different types of events, but what it's showing is that as stress or pressure increases, performance will increase to a point. At the very beginning, when pressure is very, very low and there's very little stress, you're in your comfort zone. You may be bored because it's something, maybe there's a deadline that's 6 months away, and so starting it right now, you're not really that motivated because there's not a lot of pressure. But that's where boredom occurs. Where peak performance occurs is when you increase the amount of stress just a little bit. So maybe the deadline is Monday and we only have a week to get the project done. That will motivate us. But a little bit of extra stress, remember we talked about how the brain works. When there's a little bit of extra stress, there's the providing of more dopamine and more norepinephrine up into the brain. That's where you hit the stretch zone. That's that peak of the performance curve, when you can get into the zone, when you have that little bit of extra stress to motivate you. When you go beyond that, when there's too much stress, that's when there's that dumping of dopamine and norepinephrine into the brain, and that secondary channel opens and the signal is lost. That's why we see up in that panic zone, extreme stress, complete cognitive breakdown, and that's the reason why. But the important thing is that learning has to occur, we have to get outside of our comfort zone. So when we're training at your church for some of these different things, you have to get outside of your comfort zone. The way schools do lockdowns right now in many cases is totally ineffective. They're not prepared for system failure that's going to occur. They make an announcement over the intercom, teacher calmly walks back to the door, locks the door, and they turn out the lights. They're setting themselves up for system failure because nobody's getting outside of their comfort zone. But it's also important that we don't push too far, because if we push our teachers or our staff members or our volunteers too far, it's going to be worse. We're increasing their allostatic load, their stress. They're not going to remember what we taught them, and it's just increasing their stress level. It's narrowing their window of how much extra stress that they can accommodate. Very important, we talk about mindset. You're all here for a very specific reason. You have, this is probably your ministry. You feel called to serve in a role of protector. You all are guardians. And there's a whole new emerging field of research called epigenetics, which I won't get into, but the idea behind it is that every single thought you have changes your brain. Your brain is constantly rewiring. So your brain, you're literally a different human right now than you were this morning when you first started listening to some of these lectures. Your environment, your environmental experiences, and your thoughts are continuously changing your brain, all the way down to the level of your genetic expression. Your thoughts can switch genes on and off. There's not time to go into this, and certainly, and I'm not an expert on this, but I'm fascinated by it. In fact, so many doctors now think that a large amount of chronic disease and chronic illness is a result of continuous negative thinking. Those negative thoughts over time are hardwiring certain circuits, and they are turning genes on that should stay off, or vice versa. So I say all that to say that you all are guardians. So when you are going to church and you're going to be in the role of a security team or a safety team or a greeter or whatever it is, you need to tell yourself every time, I want you to remember this, when you pull into that parking lot, verbally tell yourself, I'm a guardian of the flock. I am a protector. It's very important to verbally affirm that fact, because the more that you do that, you are creating the right pathways for genetic expression. And we get there, we're able to reaffirm our roles as guardian through exposure therapy in safe, controlled environments where we practice through scenarios. That is where we reaffirm our confidence and our ability to actually be true guardians and true protectors. And we do that through scenario training, in which we develop scripts that are going to most closely resemble the types of things that we may see in your particular facility. And the end result we're looking for is that autopilot, motor habituation, where you do it automatically. And that occurs deep in the limbic system. This is one of the most exciting discoveries in neuroscience from the last 20 years. You were probably all taught in school that when you're born, those are all the neurons you're ever going to have, and that as they die off, you're never going to get more. We know that's nonsense. We were also told the brain is like a computer. It's hardwired, it doesn't change. Complete nonsense. There's so much that changes. That's why when anybody tells you that the science is settled, it's not true at all. It is continuously being overwritten. So be very skeptical when anybody says that. This is actual growth of new neurons in the limbic system. These will actually stay and grow and be part of your brain if they plug into a network. If the brain's constantly pruning too through epigenetics. So if these don't get plugged into a network, they'll wither away and die, but new ones will be created. That's why it's important to do regular training, because the more you do that, you're going to plug those new neurons that you're creating into a network system within your brain. Now, for everybody in probably the world, except for Alex Humboldt, being without any ropes on the face of El Capitan would push us into that extreme cognitive breakdown panic zone, but not for him. But for us, when we're in a zone where we're in that cognitive breakdown area, what's happening is your survival brain doesn't like it. It's screaming. It's sending out a flare signal. It's saying, we are under attack. We are in danger. And remember, it's nonverbal. And so if the thinking part of the brain is ignoring it, the survival brain is not going to let that last for long. It will be heard one way or the other. And when that happens, they act as adversaries, where they are fighting against one another. Dr. Elizabeth Stanley talks about this. They actually have programs where they are teaching this to combat veterans, the Department of Defense, Special Forces warriors, also the U.S. Marine Corps, Marines that have come back from multiple combat deployments, a lot suffering from severe PTSD, and they're going through her program. We're going to talk a little bit about things that you can do that she teaches them that work. If you don't have nervous system recovery, if you're always, and I've changed the way I train my agency recently because of this discovery, because I'm learning more about it. I think so many areas fail. We train stressful scenarios, and we just keep doing that. And if we don't teach people how to let their nervous system recover, we are building their allostatic load. We're reducing their window of the amount of stress that they can tolerate. And eventually it reaches a breaking point. And you're not getting any benefit from the training. You are making it worse for them, and you are going to significantly stack the deck against your volunteers when the actual thing happens. And what's happening is when we have incomplete recovery, it's narrowing that window. And the narrower that window gets, eventually to a point you can't accept any more stress. You are at your physiological limit. There's a lot of symptoms of dysregulation, and I'm not going to go through them all, but I put them up on several slides just so that you can see how many there are. All these are symptoms of nervous system dysregulation, where you have a very narrow window of the ability to tolerate more stress. Things like sleep. Actually, sleep difficulty is one of the first early warning indicators of things like anxiety and depression. That's why it's so important to monitor your sleep. Hypersensitivity, hormonal imbalances, problems with decision making, difficulty focusing, brain fog. In the worst cases, suicidal thoughts, constant worrying and depression. These are all symptoms of nervous system dysregulation. You can see how many there are, and you can think, you probably are suffering from some of these. There's so many of them. Feelings of impending doom, that is a classic indicator of a heart attack. And that's why so many people that are suffering from nervous system dysregulation, it is masked as potentially a heart attack. And often they will go into the ER and they run through all the tests on the heart, and it comes back, it's totally normal. Well, it's nervous system dysregulation. So they will go home not knowing what the problem is, when there is actually a very real diagnosis. See, there are a lot. Without recovery, all that stress continues to build. It continues to build, and it can lead to inflammation, chronic inflammation, which is one of the key indicators of a lot of diseases that we're experiencing, anxiety and depression. So you have to recover down to baseline. Here's some of the tactics that are extremely important. One of the most important, you might be surprised, is diet. And that's because one of the neurochemicals that is most directly related to your well-being and your feelings of good mood and your ability to function is that of serotonin. You've probably all heard of serotonin. Well, did you know that 90% of that is produced in your gut? That's why the gut is often called the second brain now. There's millions of nerves in your gut. That's why when you're under extreme stress, you feel that tension in your gut. That's those nerves there. That's where the serotonin is produced. And you have many people, especially in the 90s, we were taught that all bacteria is bad. Everything was antimicrobial, antibacterial, and antibiotics were prescribed at the drop of a hat. And now we know that was extremely harmful. In fact, you should avoid antibiotics unless you absolutely need it to fight off an infection. But often people will go in, they'll just want the doctor to give them something. But those antibiotics, especially if they're broad spectrum, they're killing your colonies of beneficial bacteria. You have to have a much greater ratio of beneficial bacteria in your gut to the harmful bacteria. And often, because of our diet, especially processed food, fast food, junk food, the ratios are reversed. And so the idea, and those bacteria would drive your food cravings. So if you can reverse those ratios, you will now crave the nutrition that those bacteria crave in order to function. This is extremely important for our mental health, and there's new emerging research on that. The second of the triad of the most important ones is sleep. You need to fight to get 6 to 8 hours of good, deep, restful sleep every single night. Every single night. I fight for 8 hours as much as I can. I don't often get it. Harvard University found in a study, if you get less than 5 hours, you're at much higher risk of dementia later in life, especially even in middle age. In your 40s and 30s, if you're chronically sleep deprived, you're increasing your risk of dementia exponentially. While you sleep, your brain is rewiring those experiences that you learned during the day. And there's also one of the great obstacles to getting good sleep is this, the cell phone. I recommend to you turn off your notifications, put that phone in the bathroom, get a little alarm clock, a battery-powered alarm clock, and use that as your alarm, or just let the alarm go off in the bathroom. Put the phone away at least an hour before you intend to go to sleep, because these phones increase your levels of stress. Even just the glowing light increases your level of stress and will disrupt your sleep. Also, when you're asleep, they found now that there is a rhythmic power washing, a flushing of toxins out of your brain, and that's why if you don't get enough sleep, you feel groggy. This is tau protein, this green protein in here. This gets flushed out of your brain when you get the proper amount of sleep. They found that it's highly concentrated in individuals that are chronically sleep deprived, and it's also high in individuals with Alzheimer's. So that is why, that correlates with the Harvard study. That's why it is so important to get at least 6 to 8 hours of deep, restful sleep. How are you going to function in your role that you've signed up for as protector if you're not at the top of your game? If you haven't had deep, restful sleep, it's absolutely crucial. And then the third one of the triad is vigorous aerobic exercise. There is so much new research on this. Dr. John Rady, in his book Spark, he's a Harvard psychologist, or a psychiatrist, and he recommends vigorous aerobic exercise for every single one of his patients. And the reason is that when you engage in vigorous exercise, cardiovascular exercise, where you're increasing your heart rate, you're increasing your blood flow, your brain is your own pharmacy. What you are doing is you're producing all of the neurochemicals that you need in balance. One of the most important of which is BDNF, brain-derived nootropic factor. BDNF is described by Dr. Rady as miracle growth for the brain. What it does is it actually causes those neurons to expand, to grow more dendrites so you can have more connections. In fact, depression has been likened to the loss of connections in the brain. And the building up of more BDNF will counter that. It helps repair neurons, and it actually acts as a protector against damaged neurons. They found that Duke University did a study, and they found that vigorous aerobic exercise was more effective than antidepressants in treating depression. More effective than Zoloft. They also found that individuals that suffer from depression have lower levels of BDNF in their brain, and those that died from suicide from postmortem studies, they found significantly low levels of BDNF. But we have the ability, by doing vigorous aerobic exercise, to increase those levels of BDNF. These things can be life-changing. And even just physically moving, when your muscles twitch, when they move, you're producing GABA, which is, if you're having trouble sleeping, you may take an over-the-counter sleep aid. One of the primary ingredients is called GABA. It's better to produce on your own, because if you're taking external supplements, your brain may think, okay, there's too much, and it'll down-regulate the amount you're producing yourself. But when you exercise, it will help you sleep because you're producing your own GABA. Your heart also releases another chemical that's shortened to ANP, and that acts as a brake on the nervous system. It calms down your heart rate and helps you get better sleep. And these benefits are dose dependent. The more you do, the greater the antidepressant effects. And they found in long-term studies that inactivity is a major risk factor. It's also the reason why now they're recommending colonoscopies at the age of 45 instead of 50, because so many people live a sedentary lifestyle. We're not active, we're not moving, we're behind a computer all day, and then we go home and we're sitting on a couch all night until we go to bed. Inactivity is a major risk factor. They're seeing increases in colorectal cancer in younger and younger people, even in their late 20s. And it's also a major risk factor for depression. They found that in this one study, they were twice as likely to develop depression 8 years later than those who are active. Regular exercise acts as a protection against depression. And the more you do, the more you decrease your risk. And when they compare it with traditional psychotherapy, they found that 80% of those that were engaged in the aerobic portion of the treatment program, 80% remained asymptomatic after a year, whereas 50% of those in the psychotherapy had relapsed. So take this away. Vigorous aerobic exercise will help avoid depression, help you get well sooner if you suffer from depression, and it reduces the odds of relapse. And you don't have to do it all the time. As little as running just once a week can help you reduce your risk of early death. In fact, Dr. Robert Pyle credits exercise with actually saving his life. And I would tell you, it's my number one thing. Every single morning right now when I get up, I walk between 4.5 to 9 miles. It's something that I can control. I have to get out of the house and I just have to move. It's the one of the immediate things that provides relief from the trauma that I'm in right now. Dr. Pyle he lost his father, and I think also another close relative in close succession. So he was suffering from grief, and he was under extreme stress from med school, and he started developing these choking fits, and he knew something was wrong. He went in to get evaluated, and the x-ray showed these fuzzy snowball-like things in his lungs, and what it was diagnosed as disseminated sarcoidosis, which at that time was often fatal, and the doctors, it was before the term aerobics was even a term, the doctors would often just recommend rest. Well, he said he's not going to just go home and just rest and wait to die. He had to take control. Once again, we talk about that, the element of taking control, how powerful that is psychologically for your well-being and your survival. The one thing that he could control was he started walking, and then he started running again. He had run in high school, but he hadn't run for a long time. And then he started running longer and longer distances. Eventually, he was running marathons. And he said, I may not be able to control this disease, but one thing I can control is I can run this distance this day. I can make it to that finish line. And now I've achieved a goal. I've controlled something in my life when everything else feels out of control. The amazing thing is after 5 years, these reevaluations, his lungs were completely clear. The doctors, they didn't know what happened, but Dr. Pyle did. He said, it was that exercise, that's what saved my life. He took control. And a long-term longitudinal study done by Harvard found basically the same thing, that taking control is one of the most important things that we can do under adversities we face in life. That idea of fighting back is one of the most important things we can do. There's two immediate things that you can do, and I teach this now, whereas I used to teach something a little bit differently before, and you're probably familiar with that. Dr. Andrew Huberman out of Stanford University Medical School. He's a professor of neurobiology and ophthalmology. I highly recommend to you, Huberman Labs is a podcast that he does. He wants to bring neuroscience to the general public in an understandable and very interesting way. And they're great. There's so many different topics that he covers. He says if we just put it into papers, a limited number of scientists will read it, but by doing these podcasts, lots of people will have access to it. So in the lab, they're studying, that's how I found him, because they're studying the stress response and how to help people overcome phobias. Well, one of the things they're studying in the lab is breathing. And if you've probably heard of it before, if you're law enforcement, you've probably been taught this before, the idea of tactical breathing, box breathing. Inhaling for 4, holding for 4, exhaling for 4, and then holding for 4 again, then repeating the cycle. Well, that's one of the things they're studying, but he says that's not the best way to lower the stress response. When you feel the need to breathe, it's not because you need more oxygen, it's because you need to shed more carbon dioxide. It's levels of carbon dioxide buildup that's triggering that need to breathe. Box breathing, what that's doing is it's increasing your body's level of carbon dioxide tolerance. So it's slowing your breathing rate, maybe slowing your heart rate a little bit. So that's important for certain types of career fields and activities. Like I think of free diving, where they have to go down to deep depths on a single breath hold. They want to be able, and carbon dioxide will start building up, so they need to decrease their need to breathe and build their carbon dioxide tolerance. Maybe also in the law enforcement setting or military setting, snipers want to decrease their breathing rate and allow their carbon dioxide tolerance to build up, but it's not the fastest way to reduce your level of stress arousal, and that's what you need, the fastest way. If you're encountering violence at your church that you need to respond to, your heart may very quickly be thumping and pounding in your chest, and you need a tool that you can use to bring that down. Box breathing is not the best tool. Dr. Huberman says the fastest way that we know is through double inhalation breathing. And what that is 2 inhalations followed by an exhalation. The second inhalation is deeper. And you do that through several cycles. That is the fastest way through breathing that we can get into our autonomic nervous system and lower our level of arousal. Why does that work? Because unlike tactical breathing, the double inhalation breathing is maximizing your carbon dioxide offload. You want to get rid of that. The reason it does that is that right now, sitting here, you're breathing shallowly. So those little air sacs in your lungs where the gas exchange occurs, the alveoli, those are not fully inflated because you're just breathing shallowly. Well, that first inhalation, that expands them, but that second inhalation pops them open like a balloon. And what does that do? That maximizes the surface area of each of those air sacs, which maximizes the gas exchange, which maximizes the amount of carbon dioxide that you get rid of with each exhalation. That is the fastest way, and you can teach this to your kids before they take a test. You can use it when you're driving home, when you're stuck in traffic, or before anytime you're feeling extra stress. You can practice this, and after doing like several cycles, you can really feel its effect. You can feel your stress response coming down. It's immediate. The other immediate way, Dr. Huberman is also a professor of ophthalmology at Stanford University Medical School, and he says that your vision is also directly tied into your central nervous system. And we were all under the impression, myself included, that the eyes take on information and they send it as a signal to the brain. He says that's the wrong way of thinking about it. He said your eyes are brain. Your eyes are the only part of your brain that is outside of your skull. They start out inside, and then during the third trimester will protrude outside. But they are actual brain tissue, directly connected to your central nervous system. So it's an immediate effect. Whatever you take in vision has an immediate effect on your central nervous system. Well, when we're under acute stress, what's happening? Our pupils are dilating. There's a narrowing in that visual field, right? Tunnel vision. And it activates the sympathetic nervous system. The opposite is also true. If we focus on a single point, if we give ourselves tunnel vision, it will help increase our level of autonomic arousal. If we're feeling very sleepy, we can focus in on a single point, and that will help increase our level of arousal and actually wake us up. It works both ways. Looks a lot like this. The eyes are fully dilated. You can tell this is under stress response. Think of it as portrait mode on your iPhone, right? That central point, just like that picture that we showed that had the gun that was in clear focus, everything else was blurry. That's because of extreme stress. That single point becomes crystal clear and everything else becomes blurry. Well, he says the opposite of that is shifting to what he calls optical flow, and this is another immediate thing that you can do. It's equivalent to landscape mode on your phone. So instead of focusing on a single point, if you instead take in the whole horizon, that has an immediate effect on calming down your central nervous system. When you find yourself in a high level of autonomic arousal, shifting to that landscape mode can calm you down. These things are very, very important because if in your role as a protector, if you see there's a violent encounter, something that's brewing, maybe an argument that's building, something like that, you very quickly can start getting up to that high stress level. These are two tools that you can use automatically to bring down your heart rate, to bring down your stress response so that you can be able to act effectively. They also know another way to reduce your stress response is simply spending time out in nature. Call it nature therapy. In some places like Japan in particular, they have these trails, and you take your blood pressure at different levels of the trail, and you can actually see a noticeable decrease in your blood pressure as you're walking through nature. Just being away from man-made objects, just being underneath trees, being outside in nature, reduces your stress response. When we do all these things, Dr. Elizabeth Stanley says that you are able to increase that window of stress tolerance. The wider the window, the bigger the range you have of being able to tolerate additional stress. There's a couple tools that she teaches. So I was mentioning that she teaches to Marines. There's a lot of information in the general public on mindfulness and this sort of thing. This touches on that. But really what it's about is techniques for present moment awareness. Couple exercises that she teaches: focused attention, ground and release, and then attention to breathing. What these do is when we're under a dysregulated state with our nervous system, and you may recognize in yourself, especially if you have trouble sleeping, do you feel like your mind racing? Do you feel it going into the loop? Maybe there's something that's really stressing you out, and you can't fall asleep because it's just going this continual loop. Well, these techniques, and remember I said the survival brain is nonverbal, right? That loop, that's your thinking brain that's just continuing to go around. And the survival brain is saying, there's something wrong, there's something wrong. Well, to interrupt that loop, what we do, there's certain exercises that we can do, the focused attention exercises, and she says the Marines that take it seriously report back tremendous effects. And your level of stress arousal, it didn't happen overnight, so there's no quick fixes. It happens over time, it builds over time. So doing these exercises regularly will help dampen that nervous system response, but it takes time. Don't expect immediate results. The focused attention exercise, what that is, you can sit in a room and just sit in a quiet room. You're sitting in a chair maybe, and you want to bring your attention to contact points of your body. It may be your feet on the floor, maybe your butt on the seat, your back against the chair, your hands on the chair rest. It doesn't matter, you just pick one. And you just practice doing this. And as your mind starts to wander to things that are stressing you out, you consciously interrupt that loop and bring it back to that point, whatever it is, maybe your right foot on the floor, you bring it back to the sensation of that point. It's giving you something to consciously focus on to break out of that loop. Ground and release is similar. What she teaches these soldiers to do is to notice, not judgmentally, but just notice it with just non-judgmental curiosity, she calls it, some of these symptoms of stress arousal, maybe shallow breathing, tightness of the chest, high heart rate, these types of things. Just notice that, and then do the same thing. Pick a point that is firmly grounded, whether on the chair, or you could be standing or laying down, whatever, but pick that point, and then bring your attention to that. And she says, we're thinking about, what we're doing is we're telling our survival brain, there's no danger, we're being supported by whatever this object is, we're in a safe space, there's no danger, and bringing that attention to that point continuously, and your mind will continue to wander back, and every time it does, you bring it back to that point. And when we do that, we are telling the survival brain that it is safe, and that's nonverbal. And so what it's doing, it's breaking us out of that stressful loop. And there's signs of nervous system recovery. And they've found that with veterans in Iraq and Afghanistan, they've had significant results with reducing anxiety, even up to a month and a year later. Here's some of the signs of the nervous system discharge and recovery that you may experience. And she says, and I've seen this, I've practiced this on somebody that was suffering from extreme anxiety, and I actually saw the twitching. And I asked her, I said, was that a twitch? She said, yes, it actually works. And Elizabeth Stanley says, just do it for one cycle and then stop. These are some of the things that when the survival brain knows, okay, now the danger has passed, these are some of the signs of nervous system recovery. You may feel your heart rate slowing, relaxation in the chest, deeper breathing, twitching, trembling. May feel heat or chills, may yawn or sigh. But all these different things work together to tell your survival brain the danger is past. You can't practice these in the middle of the trauma or in the middle of the stress. And she talks about somebody, they tried it while they were afraid of flying and they were in turbulence. And they said, I tried this, it didn't work. So it doesn't matter, you're still in the middle of it. You have to wait until you land, and now you can tell the survival brain that everything is safe. That's the end of part one. So we're going to take a break now, and then we'll resume, I guess, in 15 minutes. Chuck said that he'd be able to put them on, I guess, on his website. So if I'm going too fast, you'll be able to get the information. And also, I have business cards over at my table. I've got my work card, but also my private email. So if you want to communicate, ask questions, suggest resources to me, I'd appreciate it. So all those are over there, and I'll be around afterwards. If you want to talk more about anything in particular. A very important technique for you to develop and use is that of visualization. We know that we train pilots, law enforcement officers, musicians, athletes. You can improve any type of skill that you do simply by visualizing it in your brain. And in fact, in some cases, it's even better because when you visualize, you are practicing what's known as domain general learning. When you actually, say, take playing an instrument, you're playing the flute or something, that's domain-specific skills. And domain-specific skills are useful, but only for a very narrow skill set. Domain general, when you're visualizing something, you're actually firing the same neurons in your brain that you do when you physically play the instrument, but you're actually improving your skill even more because it's more of a generalized context, a generalized understanding of what you're doing. So it's actually even better. But where it comes into play for you all and the role that you've decided that you want to sign up for or that you've been doing is protecting the flock. And so visualization is something that's free, that you can practice all these different scenarios and scripts that you can think of all on your own. And it becomes second nature as you practice it more and more. visualizing where emergency exits are. What type of likely scenario could you encounter that you would have to respond to at your particular church? And then how would you respond? Visualizing your actions, the things that you would say, the things that you would do. All these things, the more you visualize them, you're creating those emotional bookmarks that your brain can flip to. Because when that thing happens or something similar to it, it's not the first time you've seen it. You've already visualized it, and so you'll be more prepared. And all these things that we've been talking about up to this point, those are what are designed to get you to what's known as a state of flow, where you've heard of it before with athletes who practice it, where they're just in the zone. But it's not just athletes, it's any career field or any skill set that requires concentration and intense learning. But I would suggest to you that flow is most important when you're members of a team, and especially when that team has a job that requires working together in order to save lives. And that's what you all have signed up for. You all are part of teams, and it's important that you practice these things together to achieve a flow state together. If only one person is in the flow state, but everybody else is in that extreme panic zone, then you're not going to be a fully functioning team at all, and you may experience system breakdown. We keep coming back to mindsets and epigenetics. Mindsets are crucial because how you reaffirm your role verbally and non-verbally is crucial to how you will actually be able to function. Transforming from that victim mindset, telling yourself that you're a protector, that's what enables you to really take on that guardian role. That is crucial because that's the role that you all are in. And when you do that, it takes us beyond this fight or flight. Fight or flight is simply about just raw survival. To be a guardian, you have to be beyond raw survival because you're now training yourself to go towards the threat. Raw survival is that primary motion that tells you to go away from the threat. You all are going to be going towards it. And when you do that, when you go beyond the fight or flight response, you go towards what experts are terming the challenge response. And it's very, very different physiologically. When you look at every stressor as a threat, that has a very specific physiological response in your body. Your blood vessels will contract, your heart rate will increase because you're sensing the threat, your stress system, stress arousal is rapidly increasing. You may feel fear, anger, self-doubt. But the most important one here to notice is what your blood vessels are doing. When you experience a threat response, your blood vessels are constricting, which is very dangerous for your long-term health. So when we suffer long-term chronic stress, our blood vessels are always constricted. That's what leads to higher blood pressure, which leads to cardiovascular disease, which leads to stroke, premature death. Instead, if you view a stressor not as a threat, but as a challenge or an opportunity, instead, it has a very different physiological response in your body. Heart rate will still increase, and that is because anytime you are going to have their stress response activated, that's automatic. You have no control of that. Your heart rate will initially increase, but it's associated with superior aging and cardiovascular health. Why? Because look what the blood vessels are doing. They're no longer constricting. They're now staying relaxed. Just as when you engage in cardiovascular exercise, your blood vessels stay relaxed so you can maximize that blood flow as the heart rate is increasing. That relaxation of your blood vessels is crucial for your long-term health, better aging, better brain health, better cardiovascular health. So, some domain-specific training. We talked a little bit about protocols. You all have specific protocols for your specific facility. We look at what are they and what would you do. It's important to know that in the US, according to Alert down at Texas State University, there's an average of a 3-minute response time in the US. In a rural area, it's going to be longer. In an area like this, in the middle of Dallas, it may be shorter. We have to look at the two different elements, active shooter versus barricaded subject. They're very, very different. When I train my agents on how to respond for our active shooter defense, for our drills that we run each December, I tell them, like, this is totally different. Everything you learned at Quantico in basic agent training and from tactical training throughout the years, that's all irrelevant for the most part when we're dealing with an active shooter. Normal law enforcement tactical training, we are slowly, methodically clearing a building, typically a house, room by room, not leaving any castles in the rear, no exposed areas. It takes a while and you're completely clearing. Active shooter is complete opposite. You may be, instead of with a team, you may be by yourself. You're actively moving. If there's actionable intelligence, i.e. sounds of stimulus, it doesn't have to be gunfire, but it could be people screaming. Sounds of stimulus, you're actively moving towards that, and you are bypassing open doors, and you're bypassing threats, which is very different from how we are trained from day one. So I tell them that the training is going to feel odd. You're going to be doing things that you don't normally do. So it's very different. Barricaded subject, that's when the shooting stops, there's no more actionable intelligence. Maybe that individual is now locked himself up in a room by himself. Well, that's a very, very different response than the active shooter protocol. And it's important to remember, civilian EMS will not enter until the scene is safe. We're all DEA tactical medics are trained. We practice under the DEA medical director, but we're trained at an advanced level, so we do things the normal civilian EMTs are not allowed to do because their protocols don't allow them, because ours have to be focused on the types of injuries that we may see, and protocols that we may have to put in place, like needle decompression and advanced airways and these sorts of things. And civilian EMS, when we were going through, because we're nationally registered, you go through like the civilian training first, and it's very, very different from our training. But you have to remember, civilian EMS will not enter until the scene is declared safe. And in a large facility like this, that is going to be hours. We talked a little bit earlier, Chuck was talking about the bullet-resistant window film and the security film. That's something that we added many years ago. I first met Chuck, I think it was at a sheepdog seminar. Dave Grossman, we were talking about him earlier too. Seen him many times. First saw him in New Jersey when DEA was able to secure a spot for him. He was there, but that's when I met Chuck, because when we first moved here, I realized my kid's small private Christian school, which was attached to a preschool and a church, K through 12, was completely wide open and vulnerable. And so I wanted to give them training and show them how to tighten things up. But and the same with my church, where we started. I started their security team and kind of put it together. But I'm like, I need to limit my liability. I want to help them, but I need to protect myself, and I need to protect them. I need to protect the church and the school. And that's when I remember Chuck had that one briefing. It was basically, this is the solution to that. And I said, that's it, because now all of them will be trained as PPOs, so they meet the Texas state standards. They're doing all their due diligence, and then they act as employees of gatekeepers. They have their armed guard insurance, and so it protects the church and the school and you all as an individual. So that was very important. One of the things that we added to our school was this bullet-resistant film. That would have protected, this is Sandy Hook. They had only recently started locking those doors, but the shooter, all he had to do was shoot through it and gain access. The bullet-resistant film, what that does, the one that we added to our school, it's cheaper because we don't have a huge budget. It won't stop a bullet, like Chuck talked about, but what it'll do is it will keep the bad guy on the outside, and that's critical. That's what you're trying to do, is just buy that time, because when you put out an active shooter call, the world is coming, and you just need to buy a few minutes till the cavalry can arrive. That's your goal. And the other thing with the bullet-resistant or security film, it's also good for Texas severe weather too. It will keep debris outside. So it has like that dual function. We talk about, when I talk to teachers, sometimes they put up signs to warn people. And there's a lot of different, this applies to us too, as PPOs, and also in your churches, you have a lot of people that are armed that you don't even know about. And they may not know that you're a PPO and that you're armed and that you're going to be doing the response. I think about these qualifications all the time, and there are types of things that you need to think about too, and that's why the training is so important. As I said, range proficiency is not enough. It is a necessary qualification, but it's not enough. You have to practice scenario training, and the gold standard would be actually practicing force-on-force training with a trained evaluator that can tell you things that you're doing right or wrong, because otherwise you may be enforcing bad habits. Like I said, what we started was we created our team, and then we got trained up by gatekeepers. And there's actually a good friend of mine at work. He's talking about this with his pastor. I told him, like, you can't place a price on this. It's absolutely essential. You have to protect yourself. You have to protect your church, because if you lay hands on somebody, and the best option is to if you have a local police officer there or even off-duty cop, let them do it, the actual laying on of hands, because then you don't have to deal with it. but it will change your life if you lay hands on somebody, or God forbid, you pull out a weapon, so you have to shoot somebody. Even if you do everything right, it will still change your life. Like I said, realistic training scenario is the gold standard. It has taught law enforcement and military to win gunfights. In the past, we used to teach our soldiers to die. I remember doing training years ago at the Air Force Academy. It was an Army program in the summertime, and we wore the old Miles gear, and so you shot a blank, and it would send out a laser beam, and if it hit one of your sensors, your sensor would go off, and you were dead. Horrible. We're training our soldiers to die by doing this. With force-on-force training, you keep shooting until the threat is stopped. It doesn't matter if you're hit. Just like in a real gunfight, it doesn't matter if you're hit. You keep staying in the fight. In fact, you may not even know you've been hit until later because of the way the brain will actually block pain during this. But you need that expert coaching. We'll talk briefly about some of the protocols. This is one of the earliest ones. I hate run, hide, fight. I think this came out of Houston Police Department, and I think it was written by their attorneys. It has a lot of CYA written all over it. It does. We're telling the public that with any type of threat, we're telling fellow Americans, you just run and hide. Well, I tell teachers, you can't just run away from your students. You can't run away from your family members, and we don't just go and hide. And it gives you permission to fight for your life and the lives of those around you only as a last resort. It's awful. There's another one this is the one that federal law enforcement agencies use and that most police departments have adopted, of avoid, deny, defend. This comes out of an organization which I highly respect, Alert, down at Texas State University, actually presenting at their National Law Enforcement Conference again this year. It's nuanced, but it's still passive, just like the run, hide, fight. Avoid, they're telling people, and this is all for the general public, not for law enforcement, but they're saying avoid the threat, and we avoid the threat by either leaving or locking down, and then denying the threat by, once you get into a lockdown situation, barricading the door, with desks, with chairs, that sort of thing. And then defending, if the bad guy gets in the room, you have to have a plan to defend the room. So I like all that. But once again, it has defending as the third option. And I think that this is a mistake because fighting is not necessarily the last resort. Sometimes it has to be the first resort. And that's that's the standard we have to train to. One of the things I recommend particularly to teachers, and I did a women's self-defense class a couple months ago too, and I recommended it to them. Most Americans, especially Christians, are very, and Westerners in general, are very uncomfortable getting in each other's personal space, right? You're all very polite, you look like very, very nice people in here, right? You're probably not accustomed to screaming and yelling at somebody else in their face, putting hands on people and using force to put them down. That's why you have to train, and especially like elementary school teachers, I tell them that the most. I recommend getting involved with some of these classes. Krav Maga, I think, is a very good one. A lot of law enforcement officers off duty will teach these in a lot of different cities. But what this does is this gives you that training ahead of time, that experience, that life experience of getting comfortable with getting in somebody else's personal space, putting your hands on them, yelling at them, giving them commands, distracting them so that you can escape. And like I taught these women at the self-defense class, I said the goal is not to defeat this perpetrator, the goal is to distract them and escape. And these are very, very important. But if you haven't ever done it, that's why in the academy we do things like boxing. Because if the first time you get clocked in the face, you don't want that to be on the street from a bad guy. You want to know what that feels like ahead of time in a safe and controlled environment. So this is the model that I think, and this is my personal opinion, but I think the evidence best fits with this. And I keep it short also to just three items, because it's easier to remember. But instead of putting fighting as the last resort, it may be your first resort. And notice, moving is the first thing. In the military and law enforcement, we talk about getting off the X, right? That's where the danger is. Moving gets you out of maybe the line of sight of that shooter. A moving target is much harder to hit, so that is very important, especially if the shooter is moving too. You can only shoot accurately from a stable shooting position. If you're moving, it throws your accuracy way off. And it's much harder to hit a target that is moving. And training to move first also breaks away from that freeze response. That's why when I qualify the agents on the range, I make them, after the target threat faces away, I make them scan 360 degrees. That does a few different things. One, that breaks that tunnel vision. It builds in that optical flow, so now they're reducing the stress response, and it is enabling them to constantly train to look for additional threats. But it breaks that freeze response as well. So here's the model that I think is the most appropriate for most situations. We have to train to the worst case first. So it's not, we don't train that we hear gunshots and then we run and hide and then fight only if the bad guy in his room. You're going through this loop of, okay, what's the most serious issue that we're now facing? Well, you have to start with the most serious first. And that is that you're in immediate danger. Your life or somebody else's life is against an immediate threat. And so we have to train to that first. So we move, and we have to determine, we move to get out of the line of sight of the attacker, and then, and there's no clear-cut answer to us. There's so much gray area in this, so you have to keep that in mind too. This is just general. If the shooter is close to you in the room, we're moving, and then we have to maneuver to bring the fight to the attacker, right? The best way, remember that the shooters too may be suffering from tunnel vision, so it may only be a couple degrees off and you're in that shooter's blind spot, right? So keep that in mind too. There are certain times that I teach the civilians in my agency when you can actually, they think, well, if they're unarmed and the person's armed, it's an automatic win for the bad guy, and that is not true. There are many times when you can actually take the tactical advantage against the bad guy, one of which is when the bad guy's reloading. That's a good time to bring on the fight or to escape. But what we want to do is either, the best thing is to come from the rear or the flank and control that weapon. The wrists are the weak point in the whole system, right? You've got a weapon, whether it's a rifle or a pistol, you've got metal, and it's very easy to grab that metal and that will control the risk, and you want to control it with all your body weight, whether it be pinning it against a wall or pinning it to the floor, and then you're waiting for those who are also in the room to now bring the fight to the attacker, to get the weapon away from the attacker and then neutralize the attacker. If your life is not in immediate danger, now we have more time. Now we can slow down and we can move to one of those other two options of either seeking cover and locking down, if that's a good option, or evacuating. And in all my research, my doctoral research, over and over and over again, it came up that evacuation is often the best response. If you have a clear area where you can get outside, and this saved the lives of kids at Sandy Hook and at Columbine. Some of them weren't found for hours, but just getting out, the attacker's in the facility, getting out and just running, just continuing to run. This is what I taught my own kids when they were little. Just continuing to run into the neighborhood. Just keep going, and eventually you'll come to a house, and you can hide out over there, but you're away from the X. Hiding in the facility, when you can get out, you're now basically waiting for the attacker to try to seek you out. And if you have weak points in that room, if it's not really built for a lockdown, you're just not in a good spot. But sometimes if you don't have actionable intelligence, and you may be running into the attacker, so in that case, if you have a good spot to lock down, sometimes that's the best. But it differs, depends on your facility. Some churches are better suited for lockdowns than others. Some are not suited at all, and evacuation may be your only thing that you can do. Talked a lot about stopping the bleed this morning. That is crucial. The number one cause of preventable death on the battlefield, they've discovered through many years of combat experience in Afghanistan, was massive hemorrhaging, bleeding out. There was a long-term longitudinal study done on Army Rangers. I think it was with one particular division, and that's what they discovered. So, and I've spoken with, at the Alert Conference, the number one trauma surgeon who was the first one put boots on the ground over there. Nobody had tourniquets when they first went over there. Now, every single cop you encounter probably has a tourniquet on them, at least one. That's for him or her, because you carry your own equipment, you put equipment on yourself first, you put your partner's equipment on them when they get injured. But everybody's carrying tourniquets now. And that is that's why it's so important. They talked about stopping the bleed. Everybody has to have this training. Because like I said, you are the initial responders. You have to know how to use Israeli dressings, how to put direct pressure on. Because if it's an extremity bleed, for the most part, unless, as the one speaker talked about, if it's a femur that breaks and it severs the femoral artery, well, there's not much you can do about that, right? Even with direct pressure. But other than something like that, direct pressure can pretty much stop any extremity bleed through putting on bandages, direct pressure initially, the bandages, and then followed by the tourniquet. This is the combat application tourniquet. It's the one that I like the best. North American Rescue was presenting. That's where I get all of my civilian gear. I order through Boundtree or TAC Medical Solutions for DEA, but when I order my own private equipment, I go through North American Rescue. And I've done that for our school too. They gave me money that was donated, and I basically handpicked what I thought was best for their survival bag. The CAT tourniquet is great because it is very durable and it is simple, and you can put it on yourself. And that is what I like about it. And so when I have agents on the range, I have a captive audience, and if you haven't put on a tourniquet lately, you can fumble with it. And you don't have much time to fumble. You want to put these on high and tight. There's so much difference in what civilian EMS still teaches about tourniquets and what law enforcement and the military have learned of how to apply tourniquets. Civilian EMS used to say, they're coming around a little bit, but they used to teach that if you put a tourniquet on, you're resigning that person to a loss of limb. Nothing could be further from the truth. You can have a tourniquet on for hours, and if the limb is savable, they're not going to lose it, especially in a setting like this. They're going to be at a trauma center after not too long and let the trauma doc take it off. When do you apply a tourniquet? Any significant bleeding. How do you know if it's significant? When you see that and you say, oh my gosh, I've never seen so much blood before. And I've used these work. I've used this on live tissue, on animals, and we've kept that animal alive for an entire day with injuries that would have put that animal out within just a couple minutes. These actually work, but you have to train for them, and you have to put them on high and tight, as high as possible. The civilian EMS used to also teach you put it on an inch or two above the wound. That's wrong, because you don't know where those arteries are. They constrict, they contract, they will retract up into the arm or up into the leg. And initially there may not be much bleeding at all, because that's one of the things that the body automatically does, is it will shunt bleeding to those extremities to preserve bleeding up for the core. So you may put a tourniquet on, you think there's no bleeding, and then after a bit, when that blood returns, now all of a sudden and you may not even notice because you're tending to somebody else, and that person is now bleeding out because the tourniquet was placed too low. So we always teach now, you put the tourniquet on as high as possible. Even if you have an amputated hand, you're still going to put it on up here, right underneath the armpit. A couple reasons for that. One, you don't know where the bleeding will start. And two, down here you have two bones. The concept behind the tourniquet is it's like crimping up a garden hose to stop the flow of water. The tourniquet puts pressure, it crimps the artery against the bone. You have two bones down here, so it's much harder to stop that flow. You only have one up here. So putting that tourniquet around can much more easily crimp that blood vessel, that artery, up against the bone. Same with the legs. If you have a bleed in the legs, you want to put it up right up into the groin. With legs, you want to put on two. If you have two, you want to remove everything from the pockets before you do. Tourniquets would have possibly saved Coach Sanders at Columbine. All they could do, they didn't know how to stop the bleed. Maybe just direct pressure would have, but all they could do was put this whiteboard in the window saying that they had one bleeding to death. Tourniquets did save the life of Representative Steve Scalise. If you remember, he was in that congressional baseball tournament. One of the other congressmen, I think was also a doctor, had a tourniquet, and they put it on, and when he got to the trauma center, the trauma surgeon said that saved your life. Like I said, I mentioned I don't have any connection to North American Rescue. I just throw it, and I didn't even know they were going to be here today, but I just throw that out as one simple source that I've used in the past, and I've had great experience with them. They have bleeding control kits that you can buy. Like I said, I tend to pick different things because there's more of certain things that I want, and so I do it that way. Another thing you have to have in your go bags at church, if you don't have these, you have to have them. It's an occlusive dressing. This is just one brand, the Hyphen, but this is a very, very good one. This is the one that I buy. If you have any type of puncture wound, and it could be a stabbing or it could be a gunshot wound, you need to cover both the entry and the exit wounds. And you need to put on an occlusive dressing. You can improvise too. You could use a trash bag, anything that will block the flow of air from getting into the body. And you put it on from the neck down to the navel, because that will protect the cavity where the lungs are. If you have a gunshot that goes into anywhere in the chest up here, air can now get in from the outside, can get into that pleural cavity, but it's not going into the lungs when it does that. What it's doing is it's slowly constricting the lungs. That air is filling up the lung cavity, but it's pressing the actual lung against each other. And you can quickly die after only a few minutes with that if that's not treated. So this is something you have to have. You put the occlusive dressing on both the entry and you try to find an exit wound too. You have to look everywhere. You have to look under the armpits. It's critical that you find that exit wound if one exists and you put those on there. Talking briefly about gunshot wounds. There's a lot of misnomers. I think it's actually somewhat difficult to die from a pistol wound, with the exception of if you get a headshot or if you penetrate the heart. Either one of those is going to be fatal. Headshot probably right away, instantaneously. The heart, even if it's penetrated, that person may continue to fight back for 40 seconds, maybe a minute. It all depends. Other than that, it's actually somewhat hard to die initially, immediately from a gunshot wound. If they get care at the trauma center, you're much more likely to survive. A rifle round is very, very different. And that's because of the two types of wounds that come about from gunshots. There's a temporary cavity and a permanent cavity. The permanent cavity is the hole that everything the bullet touches as it's penetrating through the tissue and through the flesh. All that tissue is going to be damaged and destroyed. The temporary cavity is from that shock wave. When the bullet first hits the flesh, it's slowing down and it is releasing energy, and there is a shock wave, and that is a temporary cavity. With a pistol, temporary cavity is much smaller. With a rifle round, it is massive, and that is why like a .308 will do massive damage to tissue, whereas the same bullet wound from a pistol may very well be survivable. There's also several myths that I learned when I go back for PFI conferences at Quantico at the Academy. The FBI's ballistics research facility sends experts out, scientists and agents that are part of it. DEA has a permanent presence on this as well, and they do all the latest testing. They test our new weapons and our ammunition. They've dispelled all these. There's this myth that you think the bigger the bullet, the better. People used to look down on 9mm. We've all transitioned to 9mm because it has the greatest penetration. And that's what we look at when we're testing our ammo. An average of 12 to 18 inches of penetration, because if you have a large person and you shoot them at an angle, you want to have a good chance that you're still going to be able to reach that person's heart. And the 9mm will do that. 45 may not go that far, and so you may shoot them up with 45 rounds and they may still continue to fight against you. Also, we automatically think something like a .308 round that we've employed in my agency can penetrate much further than a 9mm round. That's not true. I saw it with my own eyes. We shoot bear jelly, which simulates human tissue. The 9mm rounds of the ammunition that we carry goes further than the .308. And the other myth that I used to believe, and I'm sure many of you believe, is the myth of knockdown power. There is no such thing as knockdown power. I've seen people in videos that have been shot point blank with high caliber ammunition, and they didn't even flinch. They said, one of them said, ouch, but it was only like this response you would automatically say ouch to. And that person, it was a lethal shot through the heart. That person continued to live for like another 40, 45 seconds. No such thing as knockdown power. Only in the movies do people fly against the walls. There's no such thing. You want ammunition that will penetrate far. It's very important that you all are CPR certified as well and know how to use the AED. The AED is what actually saves lives. The CPR, all that does is that just continues the oxygen flow. The heart stops, and there's still a lot of residual oxygen in there. What you're doing is you're manually pumping the heart, and that's keeping that residual oxygen moving around through the body. But that's right. But it's not enough. The AED is what will save the life. There's two shockable rhythms, and if one of those two shockable rhythms are present, this will restart the heart. It's basically a big electronic reset button, because your heart is electrical. And that's what keeps it going. This basically, if the electric part of the heart goes offline or is all in disarray, this is like the reset button. Like the IT guys always say, I go to them with my problems, they say, did you try just turning it off and back on again, right? That fixes most problems. That's what the AED does. And in a real violent attack in your church, you can bet, even if it's resolved well and nobody gets shot or hurt in any way, you probably have people that are now so stressed out that they will suffer a heart attack. And so we wouldn't want to have the inability for us to save those lives after the real threat is passed. Now you have these secondary casualties. We need to be able to save them as well. Talk briefly about situational awareness too. Not just while you're at church, but everywhere you go. And especially you need to teach this to your spouses and your kids, particularly your teenage daughters when they start to drive. We need to teach them to always know who's in the rearview mirror, and to train to look to see if people are making turns with us. Very, very important. We don't have much time to go into extent on that, but We also talked about the exit signs too. Exit signs now often are shown in green, and I think that is probably because of the loss of the ability to see reds under acute stress. I noticed this when I was in Vegas for a National School Safety Conference. Does anybody see anything unusual about this picture? Have you ever seen that before? Where? An airline? Okay, yeah, in airlines. This is the first time I ever saw it in a hotel, though. And that's probably because several years ago in the MGM Grand, they had a massive fire and they lost a lot of people. So Las Vegas knows how to do this sort of thing right. They know how they want to evacuate people, and they know how to do that right. But when I saw that, I was amazed because I've never seen that in any other hotel in any other city. And that's also, it's down low. Why? Because that's where the breathable oxygen is. Up high is where all the smoke and the flames are going to be. You're going to be down on the floor, crawling. You're not going to be able to see any exit signs that are up there over the exit sign, or over the doorways. I suspect that when you pull the fire alarm, that's when the bottom ones will automatically come on. Another important thing that you should do when you're traveling, many of you are probably staying in a hotel right now, and I always do this whenever when I would travel to Central and South America, I would always bring a little rubber doorstop that you can get from Home Depot or Lowe's. And I would use that to, especially if I was in a foreign location, I can just stuff that underneath the door, and that will delay the entry of anybody that's trying to get into the room. So I recommend doing something like that. I also always, when I arrive at my room, I stop and I turn around, and then I look to where the nearest stairway is. And then I count, and then I walk over to it, and I want to estimate the number of feet that I'm going to have to go to get, because when in the middle of the night when that alarm goes off, and I come outside and I'm groggy or there's smoke and I'm on the floor, I need to know ahead of time which direction to go and about how far down it is. And if you're staying in that hotel for a while, try going down those alternate exits sometimes so you see where it dumps you out on the street so that you'll have a little bit more situational awareness. Resilience factors. As we get into these are detailed in the book Resilience by Southwick and Charney. These come from many interviews from people that have survived the most extreme traumas. And like I mentioned earlier, I can tell you from personal experience, these all work. These are very, very powerful. You have to face reality head on. And these are important, particularly we talked about the aftermath. That first sheepdog seminar we did when I met Chuck, I think that was at Wedgwood Baptist. That school in Fort Worth had an active shooter attack, and that congregation was like a decade before, and that congregation was still in trauma. They were still broken up. The pastor, they were still in the healing process. This goes on for the long term. So we need not just to train how to stop the threat for today, you need, especially if you're in a policy role, you need to learn how to, and also in your role too, how to protect yourselves over the long term, right? Everybody's going to be affected, especially you if you're actually involved with stopping the threat. You're going to live with that for a long time, and you need to get certain treatments and counseling for that. But we have to face reality head on. This is the opposite of denial. Denying reality, it doesn't go away, it buries itself, and it will come back with a vengeance. The sine qua non, the essential thing. With any type of trauma in life, we need to accept the new reality. Once we accept it, we stop denying it, then we need to embrace it, and then we address, what can we do now? The past is the past, moving forward, okay? How can we address this trauma, this situation? This is the book that I mentioned. It's also in, I've detailed, all these resources are in the reference notes at the end. Facing your fear, very, very important. Many people are afraid of heights. I'm not afraid of heights, but at the Air Force Academy, the first time I did free fall parachuting, I was very afraid of exiting an airplane without being on the ground. So I had to face that fear. And the Academy puts you through a full week of ground school where you go through every type of emergency, hanging in the straps and learning all types of malfunctions, either with your main chute or your reserve chute. And the goal is to build your confidence to get to this point where you earn those wings after the 5th jump. And I'll still remember how scared everybody was. Nobody talked at breakfast that morning. The second week is the flight phase. But you have to face your fear to overcome it. There was one story I read about an individual. They were going up on tandem parachuting, and the plane developed an engine fire, and they almost died from it. And they were so shaken up, but he said, you know what? I need to go right back up on the next flight because I need to face this fear, otherwise I'm never going to get over this. Facing your fear is very, very important for overcoming trauma. Making your trauma your platform for your personal growth. This is so important. This is one thing that I'm doing. Dave Andrews, a good friend of mine, he was one of my cohort members when I went back for my doctorate. He got injured by a roadside bomb on deployment overseas. He had traumatic brain injury now, but his writing, it affects his math ability, but not his writing ability. He was executive director of the entire state of Colorado's Military Order of the Purple Heart. And he used his trauma as his platform for personal growth. He used that population that he had street cred with to interview for his dissertation study, and how their individual traumas, the reason that those Purple Heart recipients, their injuries then became their crucible of leadership, how it changed their lives and made them the leaders who they are today. You have to be optimistic, but optimism without realism, we can't even lie to ourselves. We know that's false, but it's important. And as Christians, we have the hope of all hopes. We should be the most optimistic people there are out there in society. People that don't have our optimism, they don't have our hope. You have to maintain your optimism. It's that optimists live longer, they live more fulfilling lives, and optimism is the kerosene that will ignite that resilience through any trauma, no matter how severe it is. Social support. Those that deny counseling and getting help after a trauma, it doesn't go away, it buries itself, it comes back with a vengeance. I can tell you this personally, I've immediately gone into counseling, and the same with my sons, because I know from doing the research how important it is. And I know that even if I can't feel all the effects right now, I know that my survival brain is learning from it, and this is gonna help, it'll help down the road. It's very, very important. And even if you aren't the one that needs counseling, we have to be our brother's keepers, our brothers and sisters' keepers, right? If you know somebody is struggling, sometimes they don't know where to turn, they don't know how to ask for help. That's where you come in. You go to them and you tell them, you will take them by the hand, you will find the resources for them, and you will go with them to those appointments. Admiral James Stockdale's book, Vietnam Experience, was required reading at the Air Force Academy while I was there. He was Ross Perot's running mate. If you're Texan, you may remember from years ago when Ross Perot was running for president, his running mate was Admiral Stockdale, who was a Medal of Honor winner. He was a prisoner of war for 5 years in the Hanoi Hilton in Vietnam, some of the worst types of torture and social isolation. Well, when asked, how did you survive this adversity? He said the number one thing that prepared him was his freshman year at the Naval Academy. Prepared him to handle adversity. And I can tell you, my freshman year at the Air Force Academy, in so many ways, has prepared for me to handle the adversity I'm in now. But he was asked, so what kept you going day by day? And he said, it was the man next door. So many of these pilots and sailors and infantrymen, when they were tortured and gave up information, they felt like they had betrayed their country. And so they were just broken and dejected. And he was there to tell them, no, you're not. You have not betrayed anything. You have withheld, you're going to return home with honor. And it was that caring of the man next door, that is what enabled him to survive. When you care for other people, it's the best thing that you can do to protect yourself. We'll have role models. I have a lot of role models now, people that I've met in grief counseling who've come out the other side and now they're thriving and they're filled with joy once again. Those are my role models. But we all have them. Find somebody else who's gone through a similar situation and emulate them. As Christians, we all have our inner moral compass. Don't deviate from it, because if you do, you'll regret it, because then you'll be living with that. And of course, the number one thing that comes up for people surviving trauma and affecting resilience is your faith. And I can tell you, without this, I would not be able to stand up here today. This is the number one thing that will help you survive trauma. And for a lot of us, this part is tough, a tough pill to swallow, right? There's so much out of our control. And when we talk about there's little things you can control, so much of it is beyond our control. And we have to accept that. You may not be able to dead stick it back to a runway, but you may still be able to save everybody's life. You're just using other options. Many things are beyond our control. We have to accept that. And very important, we have to accept our new environment. Don't grieve for the environment that you lost. That's denial. Continuing to wish that things had been different. They're not. And you take responsibility for your own mental well-being. Become a rescuer. Leave behind that persona of victim and become a rescuer, a guardian, a protector of your flock. That helps great. And most importantly, finding meaning and opportunity in the midst of adversity. There's always something. The Bible tells us that God works all things together for good to those that know him. And sometimes it's hard to see, but we know that that's true. You have to find that meaning because that makes the adversity survivable. Remember we talked about Viktor Frankl? He said, and if he says it, going through what he went through, we can take it to the bank. He said, if you have a why, you can bear almost any how. And as Christians, we have the biggest why there is, right? So we have to cling to that. We cling to that and we can bear out almost any how. And that has to start today, not next week. Don't put this off. Start putting these things in practice today because you don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. You have to develop this mindset and it takes time. Eventually it becomes second nature, but you need to start it today.